Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thanks for attending my talk. This is a talk that I've been planning and hoping to give for a while. It's a talk that I would have mentioned like about 2 cycles ago that I was thinking of actually presenting on, and it still ended up being a bit cumbersome to actually prepare and I guess probably to give a bit. Um, it's on computational social choice. So it's well, primer to computational social choice. So what would it be? Part one, I suppose, of a series of primers on computational social choice. Okay, so before we begin, just to outline a few caveats, is that this presentation is to give a primer, right? So it's just to give a quick overview of some of the important concepts in computational social choice. CSC is a complex interdisciplinary domain that draws from computer science, maths, econ, policy, philosophy, stats, etc. And so sometimes some of the concepts that could be a bit unwieldy to present in a short space of time, but I'll try my best. We're not going to sweat some of the finer details. So we're going to mention theoretical results, but we're not going to go through the proofs, their proofs. Some of these theorems actually, and as I said, in graduate level courses on computational social choice, some of these theorems actually take up an entire lecture of a graduate level course. So some of these theorems are a bit complicated. So we're not going to go through the proofs themselves. We're just going to mention these results as they come up. And this will become a bit clearer later down, but CSE has several sub areas, but we're only going to concentrate on the voting theory aspect of CSE for today, right? So the take-home messages I hope that you will take home from this would be that CSE is an interesting field, some basic concepts on CSE, some methods in social choice, and this notion of formal guarantees that tends to pervade work in computational social choice, right? So of course, like what is computational social choice? So there are 2 parts to this field's name. So computation and then the social choice bit. So we start with the social choice bit. So social choice is broadly concerned with collective decision-making procedures and how we make good collective decisions. So how do you take collective preferences or collective judgments and how you aggregate them somehow to be able to make some sort of collective decision. So there are 3 main sub areas. So the first area is in voting theory, which is actually the most popular and well-known aspect of social choice. We're concerned with how do you solicit preferences from a population in some sort of electoral process to make some sort of collective decision for this entire populace. There's also fair division, which is concerned with how you actually divide up goods, either divisible or non-divisible, based on age and preferences. And of course, in here you find interesting problems such as cake cutting with low NV, and you find interesting applications in things like participatory budgeting, which is a very interesting approach towards managing, like say, a company or even a country's finances. Then you have coalition formation, which is concerned with how do you take people's skill sets and their preferences to actually form teams of people. There are also other more emerging sub areas, but they're not that major enough in terms of literature dedicated just towards them that are called a sub area. But there's also some interesting work on judgment aggregation, which is when you have a jury of experts, how do you best aggregate their judgments to come to some sort of final aggregated judgment that you can enact on, right? So it's a very interesting field. There are a lot of practical applications of it. And I noticed I suppose we focus on the voting theory aspect of it, because each of these things on its own could be in its own little primer. Some of the maths in some of these pieces could be a little bit unwieldy, right? So complex. As I said before, like this is usually a topic that's more taught at graduate level. Some of the basic results in the field tend to take up whole lectures at that level. Now to the computational aspect. So essentially, computational social choice, you have to solicit agent preferences. You then have to process that input, and then you produce output. So obviously, this is an algorithm. Essentially, social choice is concerned with developing algorithms, right? So why this, why in the 60s there's this marriage of these ideas from computer science and mathematics into this social choice domain, which was previously just econ and poli-sci. And we bring some of the ideas and methods of algorithm design and analysis to bear on these social choice problems, in particular this idea of theoretical guarantees. So as you'll see in a bit, we want to be able to have guarantees over the kind of output that these methods would produce, and we also consider efficiency. Now, with voting theory, we're fortunate enough that most of the methods are polynomial time, but you have, say, for example, in coalition formation, in judgment aggregation, and in fair division in particular, you have very interesting instances of NP-hard problems cropping up within those spaces, right? So efficiency is paramount because it doesn't make sense to apply a method to which you could never actually get a solution to in any reasonable amount of time, right? Now, lucky enough again as well with voting theory, we're lucky enough that n tends to be kind of small as well. So even though there's sometimes some nasty coefficients and constants within the hidden masked away by the asymptotics, it's still reasonable to compute an answer. Right. So the upshot is computational social choice is about facilitating examination or re-examination of social choice and social choice mechanisms through the perspectives of computer science and mathematics. Okay. So let's go on now to discuss what we mean by a voting method. So in a voting method, we have a set of alternatives that we'd also call candidates A. And agents have preferences over the candidates in A. Now, in our setting, we're going to look at ordinal, right? So what we mean by ordinal preference is that voters or agents, they have a ranking over alternatives drawn from the set A, right? And this is typically considered to be a proper partial ordering. And we want to consume these partial orderings and then output a collective partial ordering over the entirety of the society, right? That's doing the voting, right? So that's what we mean by ordinal preference. It's not the only setting. There are also cases of cardinal preferences. So these are these are where agents have utility functions or preference functions that go from the space of alternatives/candidates to the space of real numbers. So different systems within here with their own peculiarities. There is also approval voting, which is an interesting way of approaching voting, wherein you have every voter has a preference that's expressed as a function from A to the set 0, 1, which indicates do you approve of this person or not, right? So there most work in CSC in the voting theory aspect tends to be done in ordinal settings. And we'll primarily focus on these ordinal settings, right? There's some work that straddles the line between these cardinal ordinal settings. For example, there's some recent work on a particular sort of facility location problem where you presume that both candidates and voters are embedded in some sort of metric space, and all you have access to are the points in which the candidates reside in the metric space, and you have the ordinal relationship of preferences, of voters, and you want to be able to actually kind of minimize a particular cardinally defined relationship given this ordinal information, preventing what's called metric distortion. So there's some interesting work straddling those lines. One of the chief concerns about the cardinal setting particularly in case of actual elections, is that this idea that it's hard to objectively compare utility functions between agents. And then with approval voting, there are concerns about whether or not approval voting violates one vote, one person, one vote. Personally, I don't agree that approval voting violates the whole one person, one vote. And there have actually been there's actually been a slight movement within the CAC community from objecting to cardinal voting methods to being more lukewarm towards them. In particular, I haven't had time to actually go through some of his arguments, but Kenneth Arrow, who's a major figure in this space, he passed away in 2017. 5 years before his death, he had given an interview where he said he changes his mind on the degree to which cardinal settings are inappropriate for electoral systems. But I haven't had time to actually go through what caused them to change his mind just yet, right? So I would only be talking about voting in these ordinal settings this evening. Okay, so let's just go again against what ordinal voting. So ballots encode all preferences, which is a ranked list of candidates / alternatives. And our idea is that we want to output good global ranking of candidates. Now, just a bit of an aside, because it's going to come up a little bit in our discussions. Essentially, the ballots that we use to vote with it can be thought of as a subtype of this, except it's a ballot where you only get to vote for one, and then you assume that you're ambivalent towards everybody else, right? So you just want to kind of keep that in mind, because you know, I'm going to talk about our current voting systems a little bit as we go a bit later down, right? So what we mean by a good global ranking of candidates, you know, that's an interesting adjective there. So you have to define what we mean by a good ranking of a candidate. Sorry, a good global ranking of candidates. And this idea now, this way, the computational aspect comes in, is that we want to formalize what is meant by a good ranking, or what is meant by a method producing a good ranking. And then what we want to do is that we want to be able to evaluate whether a method is capable of actually guaranteeing that that formal property is adhered to or not. Now, just a bit of an aside, that aside from formal guarantees, we do know, based off of actual deployments of certain methods out in the wild, we do know that some of them are more prone, even though they might be able to guarantee formally certain properties, we do know that some of them are more vulnerable to violating some properties over others. Okay, but we're going to kind of focus just more on the formal guarantees a bit more today. Usually the discussions on what tends to play off in the wild tends to be more discussed in poli-sci circles. For those of you who have attended UE as well, you remember Law, Gov, Econ, and Society. You remember that Dr. Ghani would usually give a lecture on that, actually, right? So, you know, some of these things that you would have learned a little bit in Law and Gov, it's going to come back a little bit in here, right? So we're going to get to mention some of these interesting results, right? So let's talk about some of the formal properties that we tend to like these methods to have. So one method is anonymity. So how this is sort of is that everybody has a voting profile. It's essentially their rank list, right? So you're saying essentially a method is considered to facilitate this formal guarantee of anonymity if you swap the voting profile of two voters, it doesn't matter, right? So what you would find out about these formal guarantees is that they think of you having a baseline, some sort of baseline, some arbitrary baseline of profiles, and then of course the output, and then it asks, what if we perturb something here? What change do we see in the output, right? So this idea with anonymity is that if we flip voting profiles up in this arbitrary baseline, the overall ranking should remain the same, right? So the function should not be sensitive to the particular identities of voters, right? So you see there, we're able to take this idea, which of course, of anonymity, which is common in voting systems, as we know, and we're able to formalize it a bit, a bit more mathematically, right? Right? This is important because what you see is that sometimes what you do is that you just count the number of instances of a unique ranking, right? Because if you have n candidates, you have n factorial rankings over those candidates. So you can just count how many ever just each n factorial rankings that you have. And sometimes you can use those directly in your algorithm as opposed to actually the actual long list itself, right? There's also neutrality, which basically says that if X and Y was flipped in everybody's ranking, regardless of their positions, right? Like for example, if I have X, Z, Y for one candidate, if I flip it so it's Y, Z, X, if I do something like that across all voting profiles, what I should see is that what happens in the final ranking is that the X and Y also flip. Right? So that if a voting method guarantees this to be the case, then this is considered to be a voting method that ensures neutrality. And pretty much every method that we're going to discuss later down adheres to these two, right? These are two of like really fundamental that a voting system really needs to have to be considered even remotely valid, right? Another interesting criteria is that of moneticity. Which is if a single candidate's ranking is adjusted favorably. Let's say, for example, if X is bumped up one space, then X's ranking should not fall in the overall global ranking. So basically means that if X is liked more compared to some baseline, their ranking in the global output should not drop, right? The Pareto criterion or unanimity is that if every agent prefers X to Y, then in the global ranking, X should be higher up than Y, right? So if X is unanimously preferred to Y, then X would be higher up in the ranking compared to Y. Plurality is if the number of agents that prefer X to Y is greater than the number of agents that prefer Y to X, then we say that X has a plurality on Y. So this is actually more of a definition I'm going to use throughout, right? It's not just a formal criteria, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. If I say X has a plurality on Y, that's saying that the number of people who prefer X to Y is greater than the number of people who prefer Y to X, okay? This idea of a Condorcet winner, which is that if there exists an X, that for all Y that's not equal to X in the candidate list, if X has a plurality on Y, then X is the Condorcet winner, right? So a method that guarantees that if the Condorcet winner exists, that the Condorcet winner is actually the one we crown with the gold star, then it's as if facilitates Condorcet criterion, Condorcet winner criterion. There's also the Condorcet loser, which is the inverse. That if you have somebody who's beaten by everybody else at plurality wise, in a pairwise matchup, then this person is the Condorcet loser, and they should appear at the bottom, right? So a method that satisfies this, that ensures that this would happen, is a method that satisfies this property of the Condorcet loser. Now, one thing that's interesting is that some methods might be prone to what's called a voting paradox or a majority cycle. So what this means is that you tend to have because relationships are presumed to be transitive, but some methods output a non-transitive, intransitive global ranking, right? And of course, you want to avoid that, right? Because you can't do anything with an intransitive ranking like that. Majority winner criterion: if an alternative is ranked first by more than 50%, then said alternative should be ranked first in the produced global ranking. There's a similarly defined majority lower criterion and a similar criterion called the mutual majority criteria that's defined for a subset of alternatives. There's also a very important one that is called the independence of irrelevant alternatives, or IIA. So it's a bit complicated, so I'm actually going to go to a quick example for us to discuss what is IIA and this is a procedure that violates IIA. So here's a bit of a question, right? If we tally these votes, okay, so here you have 7 voters had the profile PDW, 6 had the profile DWP, and two had the profile WPD, right? If we just follow our regular voting approach that we know today and we use today here in Trinidad, here's a bit of a question. Who is the winner of this election? Oops, sorry. Anyone guess? It'll be P, right? Yeah, it'll be P because they're the ones with which, because remember in our system we just ignore we just take your first ranking and whatnot, right? So it's like 6 voted for P, 6 voted for D, 2 voted for W. Now here's an interesting question. Let's say I delete W, right? If I delete W, what happens to the 2 voters who voted for W as number 1? Who do they vote for now? P. So who's the winner of that election?
Again, P.
Sorry? Oh, it says I use the wrong example. P7. P. P ranks to W. P. Yeah. So what happens there is that you have a case by deleting an alternative. You actually ended up changing what the outcome of the election would be. So if you have a case like that, you have this irrelevant alternative spoiling the vote, right? So we actually know about this a lot in our system, with third parties, right? That's why people say, oh, it's like third parties here in trans, like, oh, you're spoiling the vote. That's because our method violates the guarantee. It's incapable of guaranteeing independence of irrelevant alternatives, right? Right. So a couple of those we later no harm, which is if I vote for a candidate, if I vote for a less preferred candidate lower down, they might hurt the candidate I prefer higher up. Participation criterion avoids what's called the no-show paradox. So there are actually voting systems where it is beneficial for you to avoid voting. So if you want your guy to win, it's actually better for you to not vote under some circumstances. So, but if a method adheres to the participation criterion, it avoids this no-show paradox, right? There's also what's called a method is considered non-dictatorial, or is considered non-dictatorship if there does not exist a voter whose preference kind of dictates the overall ranking. So what you might do is that in some methods, it's possible that if you have this one person, depending how everyone else votes, this one person is basically pivot. That if whatever arbitrary changes they make, despite whatever the profile is for everybody else, whatever their ranking becomes the global ranking that's produced, and you don't want that, right? Because that's what we call a dictatorship in a social choice sense, right? So some of these properties are properties relating to the quality of the rankings themselves. Others, like participation criteria or later no harm, are what we consider to be strategy-oriented criteria. These are criteria where the idea is a good voting system should discourage people from voting strategically, because a good voting system should encourage people to accurately represent their preferences. And if it does not do that, if it incentivizes misrepresentation of preferences, it encourages strategized voting, which we consider to be a bad thing, right? right? So here two impossibility theorems. So the first impossibility theorem is Arrow's impossibility theorem, which was devised by the late Kenneth Arrow. It was actually one of the things that won him, I believe, his Nobel Prize in Economics, for which he is still the youngest person to ever receive it. Well, he was the youngest person when he received it. He was the youngest, right? The age of receiving it, is the youngest across all laureates of the Nobel Prize in economics. And he proved something that freaked a lot of people out. He proved that if a voting system is Paretian, right, it satisfies the Pareto criterion, and IIA, then that voting system has to be a dictatorship, right? And it's like, okay, well, that's not great. And then soon thereafter, after Gibbard and Swartwaite, proved that every voting system that is not a dictatorship encourages strategic manipulation and strategic voting. So that's not exactly great, right? That pretty much says that democracy is one big sham. If you kind of think about the deeper implications of it, which is kind of unpleasant. So all the methods are bad. And the statement by economist Thomas Sowell kind of comes up here, is that there aren't any true solutions, only trade-offs. So what it turns out to be is that when we talk about social choice, you have to kind of pick your poison, right? You need to decide which criteria is important, which ones you're willing to forego, and try to actually come up with a method, or to see if you want to use a method that adheres to these particular collection of properties. Some combinations, I said, aren't even possible, right? And some combinations actually make things intractable, right? So some methods are computationally intractable. And the designs encouraged by certain combinations or criteria are computationally intractable, right? So this is actually a list that exists on Wikipedia, some of the major voting methods, some of the formal criteria that they actually managed to satisfy. Does anybody remember what's the formal name for the one that we use here in Trinidad? Anybody from Law and Gov? Who would have done Law and Gov? No? Okay, well, it's plurality, right? It's more commonly called in political science circles. It's called first past the post, right? So that is one about eighth to last on that list there. So you see this long block of red, right? So it's not very good formally, right? It has a lot of flaws. It's also the one we use the most in the world. It satisfies a couple of criterion, but this is actually slightly misleading, and in practice in particular, because in plurality voting, our ballots only allow us to X one name. So you kind of get rid of later no harm and later no help by just getting rid of your ability to have nuanced preferences. So that's like that's like saying that you're afraid of stubbing your toe, so you cut your whole foot off, right? So it's not that great a system. It is very easy to compute though, right? It's linear time to compute an answer and the first past the post, but it's not particularly a particularly nice system, right? It has a lot of flaws. What we're here for is an interesting alternative to this is runoff voting, which is probably second most popular voting method to plurality voting. It's still not perfect. Of course, none methods are. But in particular, what's interesting is that it violates IIA in theory, but what we find is that in practice, it actually manages to reduce the spoiler effect, right? Which is why it's the second most popular voting method next to plurality voting, because the spoiler effect is considered by many people, myself included, to be a very huge damaging thing to democracy, right? Because you kind of always forced or between A or B. It disallows over time third parties from actually making inroads into gaining support. So so even though runoff voting in theory is still vulnerable to it, in practice it tends to be less vulnerable than plurality voting, which practically entrenches the spoiler effect. Right, and for those who don't know about runoff voting, how it works is that you count voters' first choices. You ask if there's a candidate that has a majority. If not, you eliminate the last place and you loop around. So in effect, your vote, if like say a guy you vote for first loses, like he gets knocked out, your vote for him transfers to your second, right? And that you can see mechanistically why this should encourage people to vote for third parties a bit more, because they feel more comfortable thinking that their vote isn't going to be wasted, right? They can always put whichever one of the major parties they want as their second to last choice if they so choose, and their vote will not be wasted, right? And so the idea is that this will help prevent like minority governments from emerging, etc., right? So this is why in practice it's considered better than plurality voting, even though theoretically it's still vulnerable to II. There's also an old method called the border count. So the idea here is that you compute the number for every pair of candidates. Sorry, so for every pair of candidates, you compute how many more people prefer them, so like say A to B, right? So the net of A greater than B is the number of voters who prefer A to B, right? And then the border count is the sum for every A across that net preference, those net preference strengths, and the winner is the candidate with the highest border score, right? This is actually used in some internal party elections in Slovenia. And here, as you can see, it still, is this on this list? Yes, it is. Okay, yeah, it still misses out on quite a few criteria there. There's also the Condorcet winner method, Condorcet approach method. So the Condorcet method is that you basically have, from the rank list, you construct essentially what are a bunch of peer-to-peer mini elections, and basically the candidate that wins the most of these mini elections wins your Condorcet winner, and is the winner that's chosen. However, this is where you have like that voting paradox showing up. And there are times when you don't always have a Condorcet winner because of ties and whatnot, right? Duncan Black's method was to use the Condorcet method, and if it fails, as in you can't find a Condorcet winner, then you fall back on the border count method. There's also an interesting approach which also piggybacks off of the Condorcet method, called DODGSON'S method, created by Charles Dodgson, who most people actually probably know under his pen name Lewis Carroll. He was also, aside from being a mathematician, he was also the author of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. And the idea here is that if the Condorcet winner method cannot find a winner, you basically permute voters' profiles until you can get a Condorcet winner. And you want to perturb those rankings as little as possible. So that's actually where this method actually becomes intractable, because it turns out that this is reducible to the exact cover problem, which is actually one of COP's 21 NP complete problems. So this method is just out of the question because it's NP hard, right? But I just thought it was like an interesting way to kind of piggyback off of the Condorcet method. What's also really interesting is this other method called the SCHULZE method of voting. So the idea is that you construct this pairwise directed preference graph. So here you have, okay, in this graph here, you have 23 people prefer E to A. And then you use a variant of the Floyd-Warshall algorithm to compute as what's considered to be the strongest paths. And then from there, you could compute the degree of overall preference for a particular candidate amongst the voters, and then you can actually compute a winner. So this is actually the algorithm for it. So it's actually pretty easy. I mean, this is just, you can imagine implementing this in some little bit of code in terms of Python, right? It's very easy to implement. So after you run, you construct this pairwise preference matrix on your left, and you run this algorithm on it. What you get is that you get something like on the right. What you pretty much do is, okay, if you look at, so I kind of can't see because this is kind of blocking a little bit, but let me see if I choose. All right, okay, so in P, B star versus P star B, right? Now, P star B is greater than PB star, right? So that you flag those higher ones like that in that kind of approach. You flag it as green or red, and then what you do is that you look at your rows, and the row with the most green is the winner. So in this case, an easy winner, right? Right, because you pass strength from E to everybody else versus from everybody else into E is across it is larger. So because of that, E is the overall winner, right? And the ranking can also be produced from this other matrix by looking at the number of green cells in the rows, right? But what's interesting, I found with Schulze method is that it tends a lot of tech people tend to like it. The French Wikipedia uses it. Several what are called the pirate parties across the world. So these are pirate parties, political parties that have open source and wanting to loosen copyright restrictions as their foundational ideology. And a lot of them tend to use it. Kubuntu, Ubuntu, Debian, they actually use the Schulze method in the internal voting. Haskell, the Haskell Foundation, which manages the Haskell programming language, uses it. The FFmpeg project uses it. What I found a bit of an interesting, this thing is not like the others, is that MTV's board apparently uses the Schulze method to make decisions, which I found a little funny because like all of these are like these tech companies and these open source projects, and then you have this MTV just being there, using this method to make decisions. I thought that was a little funny. There's also, I guess last thing we talked about is this method called the ranked pairs method. So it's similar to Condorcet method in that it uses pairwise victories to determine these P2P victories. But what it does is that it sorts pairs in the list from the most marked victories from the least. So who has the strongest victories over other matchups? And then what you do is that you construct a directed acyclical graph going through this list, right? And you actually check to make sure you're not adding a cycle. Now, what happens is because of this, it turns out that the parent of the DAG is the winner of the election, right? So it satisfies all the formal criteria we saw above. It only fails to satisfy participation, later no harm, and later no help. And it's also fairly simple to implement and understand. Personally, if I was to ever redesign our democracy over an ordinal ballot system, I probably want to choose ranked pairs simply because it fulfills it. In fact, if you come back here, so local III, LIII, so A is a weaker condition than standard IIA. But there are only two methods that satisfy it, right? It's the Kemeny-Young and the ranked pairs method. So the fact that LIIA, you at least get some formal protection against IIA, even just a formal protection only against a small subset of it. To me, that makes it an encouraging method. Right. In terms of further reading, I sort of just kind of scratchy surface. So this choosing what to actually present was kind of difficult. This is usually like, even just in the voting theory aspect of it, this is usually an entire course, right? Where a lot of proofs, a lot of reading of a lot of papers from econ, poli sci, comp sci, maths, all across. But if you want to learn about these things on your own, there are a couple of things places I'd recommend. The Wikipedia articles for these things are actually pretty good. I'm actually quite impressed with the quality of those articles and how well they're cited. Etc. They actually cite the papers directly, which is also a nice sign. But another place that's pretty good to look at is the Handbook of Computational Social Choice. The one complaint I have with this book is that sometimes, especially when it comes to going over some of the former results, it tends to explain some of the proofs in a way that's a little unintuitive. But it gives a nice overview of the field. Excuse me. Aside from that, there's also Hodges' the mathematics of voting in elections, a hands-on approach. This is actually a nice book because it's actually very amenable to an undergrad course in computational social choice. So if like you kind of, it feels like you lack some of the mathematical maturity to dive into the handbook, this is a good place to start. If you're coming from one econ side, the theory of social choice is Introduction to Social Choice theory is another good one. Amartya Sen's expanded edition of Collective Choice and Social Welfare is also a nice introduction, especially coming from our econ poli-sci background. If you're not coming in with a lot of mathematical maturity, the Maskin and Sen's Error and Possibility Theorem gives a bit of a better breakdown of Errors and Possibility Theorem than the Handbook of Computational Social Choice. Handbook of Social Choice and Welfare. This is a good book for covering these nice terse summaries, some important papers in the field that a bit more recent you might not find in these books. The thing is, so computational social choice is very much related to game theory, and so it's useful to also familiarize some concepts from some game theory. And like, to me, the best textbook out there for game theory is Stephen Taddelis's game theory. Right? And this goes not just for understanding computational choice, but for game theory. Who is probably the best textbook I've ever come across for game theory. So with that, thank you for listening, and we'll open the floor now to any questions.
Yeah, nice presentation, Inzamam. I didn't realize there were so many options for voting. But in our case in Trinidad, I mean, basically we have two parties, and the issue tends to be when one party wins, they dominate things. There's no proportional representation, and it's roughly 50-50. So that tends to be the issue. So you have any thoughts on that, or you did any?
Proportional representation systems, that really is more squarely in the house of poli-sci. I guess interesting to try to see if there's a way to marry some of these methods together with those ideas of proportional representation. But here in Trinidad, we do need a lot of things to change. I guess to me, what got me interested in this was this. I really don't like the spoiler effect. Like to me, like the only incentive disincentive a politician has is that they can be voted out of office. But if you have where people are afraid to vote for third parties, then they're going to say it's just a coin flip if they could stay in office or not. So that removes that important disincentive, and that to me, that's why to me, like I was really interested in this area. It's like, can we find ways that reduce spoiler effect? And then of course you read about these other criteria and all that, and it's quite interesting there. I think what's also really interesting in this space as well is things like cardinal voting, which is voting with real numbers instead, or something's called star voting, where you actually give a candidate a ranking out of like say 10 of how much you like them or not. But yeah, I guess it's the spoiler effect aspect, and then that proportional representation aspect. But I don't often find a lot of work in the computational social choice space talking about proportional representation. So maybe that's something we could actually look at in terms of being able to marry those ideas, because you don't often find. I mean, a lot of the computational social choice community is still very much invested in these ordinal methods with a single winner. So I suppose it'd be interesting to kind of adapt maybe something like the ranked pairs method. Like maybe there's a way you can adapt it to explicitly get the proportions for the different voting districts. I guess that might be something interesting to look at.
Okay, nice. Thanks. Yeah, no more questions from me. I see Kevin. Kevin has a question.
Yeah.
Hey, Inzamam, really good presentation. So the thought I had, right, was two thoughts. One was on CONDORCET, right? Is it that it has both rank as well as count can lead to the importance of a vote? That's one. And the second one is in terms of just thinking about it a little bit more intuitively. And actually, I was thinking about it from a telco standpoint, in terms of when a customer calls, they try to tend to call within the same network, right? They get preferential rates. Could the same thought be transferred across to voting, where like perhaps a family would express to a certain party or entity, for example, because they will get preferential quote unquote rates, you know? So there's that idea of stickiness amongst voting and families.
But on the first bit, in terms of the CONDORCET method itself, it's very simple. That's why it tends to have this sort of issue with voting paradox cropping up and stuff like that. But in terms of it's really the rank pairs that actually kind of incorporates like the kind of orderings. But the idea here is that if there is a CONDORCET winner, which is the one who is preferred by everybody else, they should appear within rank pairs. So that's what usually kind of helps. But a rank pair is a method. All the methods we discuss here are anonymous methods, in that they guarantee anonymity. So the actual votes or when they're cast don't matter. Just that the votes exist.
Okay.
In regards to the second bit, I feel to some extent that might be more of a poli-sci question. I can't really think on the top of my head what would be an answer to that.
Yeah, it's just something interesting to think about, right? In terms of you tend to have that cohesiveness amongst families for voting. Definitely you see it very prevalent in Trinidad from a socio-economic standpoint. People tend to vote who their families vote because of the benefits it has to the family. So it was just definitely something. But if we could have ever found that data in terms of household votes, then that is something I think that can add a lot of value to these kinds of research here in terms of rank pairs and CONDORCETs and things like that.
Yeah, but that's really, I guess.
Well, not CONDORCETs because of the anonymity, but from the rank pair standpoint, yeah.
Well, yeah, but I guess like the really trade, that's more like really more poli-sci kind of thing. That's more, I guess, more empirical in a sense. But of course the issue is getting that data, right? Because you kind of want to, that kind of voting data is always something that's a little finicky to kind of get, and the ethical questions about that and all that, in terms of like, that's an interesting point there in terms of, I guess it'd be really interesting to talk to like somebody from a poli-sci community, how they actually go about doing some of that research ethically, whilst maintaining people's privacy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Greg, no problem. Greg, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Inzamam. That was a really good presentation. I was just wondering, kind of related to the last Kevin's point. I was wondering if there was such a thing as a Nash equilibrium for voters, and if when people vote in their household, the same way that their household votes, isn't that really just them finding their mini Nash equilibrium? And how do we overcome it?
Well, actually, that's where a lot of strategy proof criteria like participation, data no harm kind of comes to play to some extent. Because the idea is that how you actually go about this is that you show that you that in Nash equilibrium is for people to misrepresent their preferences. So like say as well, like IIA, like the whole reason it's a problem is because it encourages a strategic voting. So the idea is that with these methods, you want to because you can't, but you want to make it so that like some Nash equilibriums are under some of what would otherwise be Nash equilibriums don't end up occurring when you look at the system formally within the context of those methods. And in terms of the family aspect of it, I know there is some recent work in looking at social networks and some computational social choice. But isn't too much work in that sort of space yet, because I can't recall ever seeing like say a formalized criteria that says, okay, you know, in terms of like sort of familial voting, like most formal criteria just consider like are not placed in like a social setting, but that would be an interesting thing to probably work on. But
Okay.
I forgot to
Cool.
mention as well. So something where I think this could be applied in a social in a machine learning aspect is that you know, when you see ML papers and they benchmark different algorithms on the same data set, essentially you get a ranked list. So it'd be interesting. I would also be interesting. What if you use a social choice method to kind of come up with a sort of best practice guide for this problem within the ML community? But that's just been a side thought I had a while back. Something as well I forgot to mention is that maybe when I get to fair division, I can talk about it a bit more. Is like with participatory budgeting. That's also an interesting thing that kind of plays with some of these ideas and what's called a liquid democracy. So the idea of liquid democracy is that it's a middle ground between direct democracy and representative democracy, where you have the ability to assign or to retract the ability to vote on your behalf, and you have a way of voting for yourself. So like say, for example, there's a particular piece of legislation, right? That let's say you don't like, and the person you delegated your vote to is going to vote for it. You can retract your vote from that person and then vote on your own, or reassign to somebody who will vote in the way that you want them to for that particular problem. So it's a nice middle ground between that there. I think one area of computational social choice that might be interesting going forward is how these things can be applied in that liquid democracy setting. Because there's this implicit assumption that a lot of things from computational social choice actually at scale are just basically kind of would be applied like towards these sort of representative democratic election. Not that we would ever have liquid democracies. I don't think the powers that be would ever like the idea of power being wrestled from them, right? So
Yeah. But further to that point on participatory budgeting, I always thought it was interesting from the behavioral economic side of things that if you asked two people to split $100, you know, the people only accept things that are pretty close to each other, you know, like 49-51. They would never accept a 1 versus 99, even though 1 is better than 0.
Yeah. But it all does, I guess, working there with the a lot of like the sort of formal guarantees and the currently Nash equilibrium and those circumstances and stuff like that. Personally, I think participatory budgeting is a really nice idea, probably more practical than liquid democracy. Because like then essentially you kind of get to say what money is used for. But once again, right, powers that be would not like people actually having control over their tax dollars. Like taxpayers have control of the tax dollars. What kind of blasphemy is this, right?
But I think we're missing a whole thing on with liquid democracy and the dangers of it, where corporations and other entities of power can then basically hijack that effort to then say, hey, listen, all these people are now have assigned their votes to me and I vote in my interest. And they would then pay or coerce that interest towards them. And they do that right now in, or they have been doing that with fracking, where they would get they would be in a strip of area, and they would basically assign, like, get a trailer, keep it in the middle of nowhere with an address, and then one family lives in that address, and then one family votes the way the corporation wants. And then suddenly that whole area is now free and available to be developed for whatever the interest of that corporation is. So there's, like, I think there's a second level of second order of I guess games, right? Where you now have where it's not necessarily the voter versus voter, but voter versus special interest, and the wealth of that special interest in and their capability to influence and hijack.
Yeah, that is true. That's a very fair point against the critique against liquid democracy. But then again, I mean, at the end of the day, too, I mean, they still do that through lobbyists.
So, well, when you get to representative system, yes. But, like, you know, if you own shares in a company, if you decide to abstain from voting, then the company votes whichever way it wants to with your votes. You know, or whoever, I'm sorry, not the company, the holder of your stock. So whoever it will be, who actually owns, who you trade through, then basically votes in proxy for you. It might be interesting for you to, like, look into that, like how many, like when people get upset, especially those activist things. That's why it's so important to hold a 5% margin in a company, because if you own 5% or more, you technically can sway a larger chunk of the voting population than others, and then you're considered, like, you know, a majority, like, you're not a majority shareholder, but you're in a good spot.
That's an interesting point there, yeah, to look into. I wonder, is there mechanisms to kind of help block, like, what you're saying there with the corporate interests, probably messing with the sort of liquid democracy type settings. I guess that's interesting. But it's still relatively nascent field of research. So, but so I'm really interested in what kind of comes out in terms of those sort of domains kind of handle that.
Yeah, it's definitely worth the research. I think the problem is that liquid democracies only really work not work, but they're mainly applied within stocks where you can assign, where there's only one place to assign your vote and your vote is still counted. It's not like you abstained, you actually voted, but somebody else voted for you and they told you what to vote, or voted on your behalf, but didn't vote what you wanted, I should say, or would have wanted in your interests. So I don't know how you can track, like, how many people actively voted versus were proxy voted or anything like that. But if you could, that would probably be the main sign, or a main influence. And then you have to then figure out, like, oh, what would you have voted for had you known?
Yeah, that's an interesting point there. Looking into these things a bit more in depth is kind of like my plan for once the PhD is over. So I have some ideas of things I could look into.
Oh man, you just glutton for punishment.
Yeah, I suppose, I guess. But I mean, like, as I mentioned before, like, you know, to me, it comes down to, like, you know, I really don't like the way things are run at a fundamental level. So, I guess that's why I kind of like the idea of looking for alternative views. I mean, nobody's ever going to take any alternative solution, right? So, but at least I could feel as though I investigated things well enough. I actually put those thoughts out there, even though it's futile.